Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at device soll, dich, empfangen, which translates to, Ah, Lord, how shall I meet thee? This is a pretty unusual chorale. There are chord progressions that you typically don't see, and with the just overall activity of the chorale in terms of the subdivision of the chord progression and the counterpoint, especially towards the end, it's hard to pick out exactly where modulations occur, and yeah, we're just going to talk through the chorale as we get to it. So no key signature, we start on E major, we end on E major, so I reckon that our overall tonality is A minor. However, we have a very unusual thing happening here at the beginning, and this is just based on the way that I hear the melody and how it agrees with the harmony, but I think we have a very quick modulation here. Even though we start with the idea of A minor, I think we quickly shift to C major before going to A minor by the end of the phrase to accommodate this half cadence. So we start on 5, passing 7th in the alto, and then we get F, A, C, and A, which is 6. So we start things off with the deceptive harmony, or a deceptive progression rather, and I think this is where we go to the key of C major, and this is now our 4 chord. I think you could make the argument that we stay in the key of A minor for the entirety of the phrase, but to me it just sounds so much like C major for this measure that it's hard for me to be convinced otherwise now that I've heard it with that bias. So we have an anticipation in the melody here, or sorry, in the alto, and then we have G natural, B, D, and G, which would be a 5 chord in the key of C major, or if you're analyzing an A minor still, it would be our 7 chord. This E is another anticipation in the alto before we get A, C, E, and F. Bit of deceptive harmony again. In this case, it's 4-6, F major over A. Then we have some non-chord tones going on in the lower 3 voices. We have B, D, D, and F. That's a 7 chord. B diminished in root position. And then we go to C major, C, G, D, and E. But of course, this D is like a 9/8 suspension over the bass. Accented non-chord tone of sorts. And I think this is where we go to the key of A minor. Bach presents a zone here. Any of these chords could be modulating back to the key of C major. This is just where it sounds like it starts to me. Back to the key of A minor. We're currently in the key of C major. But afterwards we go to F, A, C, and D. That is D minor 7 over F, which would be 4-6-5. Kind of unusual to get a 4-6-5 chord here. Should have also specified that this is a Phrygian half cadence because of the motion in the bass, half step down. This G sharp is a neighbor tone. And then we have F, A, B, and D. You could make the argument this is a 2-4-3 chord. Again, 2-4-3 chords often pop up in the context of the Phrygian half cadence because of the counterpoint. However, I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and really we're just continuing the idea of the D minor chord here, but we could go ahead and say that we changed the figure bass to remove the 7th because the C is no longer present, and just put it in first inversion, which would be an 8-6 or F, A, D, and D. So we have, there's actually no octave here. So why would there be an 8 there? I guess the 8 is removing the idea of the 7. So there is an octave in the chord, and then we have a 6th from, A to F would be the 6th. So I guess it would be an 8-3. Maybe I'm overthinking it, I don't know. But we do cadence on 5. F, G sharp, E, G sharp, B, and E. Making this, our half cadence that I just talked about. So it's unusual. I hear this in the key of C major. Could be analyzed in the key of A minor because they're both the same pitch collection. I think it ultimately depends on how you hear it. Like I said, use your ears and trust what you hear. But afterwards, we're going to stay in the key of A minor until the end of the section, and we end in a perfect authentic cadence. We then have E, G sharp, E, and B, another 5 chord, no need to reanalyze. Then we have A, E, and C, tonic triad, A minor. Our first A minor chord, I believe, in the entire chorale, even though we've been referencing A minor throughout. Kind of cool. Passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor before we get F, C, A, and C. I think this is a 6 chord with a passing seventh in the bass. You could analyze it as 1-6-4 as well. Sometimes that is the case, but in this case I feel like it's a 6 chord. And then we have D, F, A, and B. That's B minor 7 flat 5 over D, 2-6-5. Bach loves his 2-6-5 chords. This C is an accent, or I keep on saying accented non-chorded tone. This is just like a very brief passing tone, or part of like a just decorative. But we do kind of get the idea of the chord being in root position just for a brief moment here with the B, the D, the F, and the A. So I will mark it because it's unusual for us to see the entire chord intact. But before our after our 2-6-5 chord, we do get the chord we would typically expect: E major, E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord, passing seventh in the tenor, and then we cadence on A minor, A, C, E, and A, tonic triad in root position. Okay, looking ahead, we have another phrase that, well, I say another phrase because it's in reference to previous cadences we've seen in other videos or other chorales, but we have another one of these cadences that could be either plagal or imperfect authentic, depending on the way that you look at it. Or I guess it would be perfect authentic because of the way that the melody resolves, but it's either authentic or plagal depending on how you look at it. It just has aspects of both. But starting things off, we do immediately go to the key of C major. This A minor chord here, I reckon, is our gateway to the key of C major. It's now our 6th chord, passing 7th in the alto, and then we get D, D, F, and B, which is B diminished over D. That's 7-6. Passing tones in the melody and the tenor before we get E, B, E, and G. 7 going to 3. That's a good sign. Typically 7 goes to 3 or 1. Sometimes we see it go to 4 in like a transitive fashion, but here we see it functioning normally. It's starting off the cycle of falling fifths progression. Passing 7th in the alto before we get F, A, C, and A. It's a 4 chord, F major. This E is a passing tone. This G is a passing tone. Has a bit of a A minor 7 passing chord vibe here, but I don't think that's contributing too much to the chord progression, so I'm not going to analyze it. But we then have D, F, F, and B, another 7 chord here. This B diminished over D, so 4 going to 7-6. That's a good sign. 4 typically wants to go to 7. This G is a passing tone, and then we get A, F, and C. So a bit of transitive harmony, kind of a deceptive progression in a way, because we would expect 7 in this context to go to 1, but here we see it going to a chord with 6 in the bass, so it's very similar to this progression. Did we have one earlier, a deceptive progression? Maybe I'm just making that up. I think I'm just making that up and just confusing it because I analyzed it earlier. After our 4-6 chord, notice how the bass is always connected by the leading tone when we go from 4-6 to 1 in this ascending pattern. That's like true for every single time it occurs, which is pretty neat. We then have C, G, E, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position. This F is a neighbor tone, this D is a neighbor tone, and then this C is a redundant chord. We see the same chord twice. So the reason why this cadence could be perfect, authentic, or plagal, maybe authentic is more of an accurate title. I'll just put authentic there because I'm unclear as to whether or not it's imperfect authentic or perfect authentic. Like, you know, what takes precedence in the hierarchy of taxonomy here? Like, is it the melody having the root of the chord in it, or is it the fact that it's preceded by a dominant? What's more important? I'd say they're kind of similarly equal importance. You know, the cadence requires both parts in order to be whole, but the reason why this could be a plagal cadence or an authentic cadence is because the leading tone is creating a sense of dominance. It's resolving to the tonic, so it doesn't just feel like a 4 going directly to 1. It feels like there's 4 with a little bit of extra heft, which in my opinion, pushes it more in the direction of the authentic cadence. At least that's how I hear it. So trust your ear. It's something that I say quite frequently, but if you feel like this is a plagal cadence and the leading tone isn't sufficient enough to push you in the direction of it being an authentic cadence, that's totally fine, no big deal. I think they're both accurate analyses and can be backed by evidence that's here. Looking ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of D minor, and I think that for the most part we modulate straight away. After our C chord, C, C, E, and G, it's redundant, we don't need to reanalyze it. We go to F, F, A, F, F, C, F, and A, which is our 4 chord, and in the key of D minor it also happens to be our 3 chord. Some passing tones in the lower voices before we get D, E, B flat, and G. This is a pretty interesting chord. This is 2, 4, 2, E minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is kind of cool. 2, 4, 2 chords. They're not unprecedented, but they're definitely unusual. Just 4, 2 chords in general are on the rarer side. Typically we see 5, 4, 2 chords with the most frequency, but we see all sorts of 4, 2 chords in certain situations depending on how Bach harmonizes over the bass. But afterwards, I think this 2, 4, 2 chord is actually important because of how the 7th resolves, right? D does go down to C sharp. And this A is also a non-chord tone, but when you take the aggregate of the rest of the notes on the chord, we have C sharp, E, A, and G, which is A7 over C sharp. That's 5, 6, 5, which is where 2, 4, 2 wants to resolve, which is pretty neat. And then we have D, D, A, and F. So this is just a subdivided 2, 5, 1 progression, and we're seeing with some pretty interesting inversions to supplement the chord progression, which is pretty cool. We then have C sharp, G, and E. This alto singing's the alto is singing very, very low here, but this C sharp is a neighbor tone, this G is a neighbor tone, this E is a neighbor tone. It spells like a passing 7 chord or a neighboring 7 chord, but because we have this D suspended in the bass, I'm not going to mark it on the page, but do know that the chord is more or less entirely intact and there, so it smooths out, it does create a sense of a subdivided progression between these two 1 chords, because on beat 4 we do just have another D minor triad, D, D, A, and F. This G sharp's a non-chord tone. That D is actually a chord tone. I marked that as a non-chord tone in my notes, but it is a chord tone. But when we take the rest of the chord, we have D, G sharp, D, and F, which is kind of like an incomplete G sharp fully diminished 7th in second inversion. So I'm going to mark that as 7, 4, 3 of 5, because G sharp is the leading tone to A, and A is our 5 chord, so it's functioning kind of like a predominant chord here. Before we cadence on 5, A, C sharp, and E. Then we get a distant modulation, which is pretty cool, and it's direct, where we have the juxtaposition of C sharp and C natural going on here between the melody and the alto. Here we go directly to the key of G major, and this is a D7 chord over F sharp, A, D, and C. That's 5, 6, 5. So 2 unlike 5 chords back to back. And A also happens to be the dominant of D, which is what makes this progression feel smooth. On the page, the way that it's analyzed as a direct modulation makes it look a little disjunct, but it's actually quite a smooth progression because the fact that the dominant is preceding the, or the secondary dominant is preceding the dominant, but because the phrases are separate, both because of the fact that there's a long note value and a brief pause between the phrases, it does take away from the literal connectedness, but harmonically speaking, they are quite relevant and connected to one another, because D minor and D major both have the same dominant, so it's pretty cool how Bach is using the minor key to, or the dominant to smooth the progression between two relatively distant keys. They're 2 notches away from one another on the circle of fifths. But after our 5, 6, 5 chord, we do go to 1, G, G, D, and B, G major. Passing tones in the tenor and the melody before we get G, B, G, and D. Just another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass, E, C, G, and C. that is C major over E, which is a 4/6 chord. This D is a passing tone, this F sharp is a neighbor tone. Again, with this idea of sort of passing dominant, it's like we have a 5/7 chord here, very similar to what's going on in actually in the same metric position as the previous phrase as well. So we have like a passing dominant chord, a D7, but with this E suspended in the bass, it makes it difficult to analyze. But we are not going from another 4 chord to another 4 chord. We're going to a different quality chord. We're going to E, E, G, and B with this delayed passing 7th in the bass. That would make this a 6 chord. So 4/6 versus 6, they're effectively the same chord. The only difference is the B and the D too, because that's the passing 7th. But really, if you're just looking at the triads, we have C, E, and G versus E, G, and B. They have 2 of their 3 notes in common. So I see quite a lot of similarities between what's going on here in between these two phrases. It's effectively the same progression, at least in terms of function. But after our 6th chord, we go to C, E, G, and A. That's A minor 7 over C, 2-6-5. Bach loves his 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. It's interesting that Bach morphs the 4/6 chord into the 6th chord, because even though the chords are similar, typically 6 wants to go to 2. 4 going to 2 would be a third space progression, and we see progressions that consist of chords that are a third apart from one another. But it's interesting that Bach consciously switches to 6 before going to 2, which is a much more normative progression. I think that's pretty neat. This A is kind of like putting the chord in root position as well, but we get rid of the third of the chord in the process. So I think it's I'm not entirely sure if I should analyze that. I'm not going to, because it gets rid of the intactedness of the chord. If there was a second third in this chord somewhere and the root would be replacing one of them, that's totally fine. But here, it's not the case. We then have D, D, F sharp, and A. That's our 5 chord, D major, and then our imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major concludes with G major, G, D, G, and B. And as we're closing in on our final cadence in the key of A minor, we do go through C major to get there. So this G is functioning like our 5 chord in the key of C. And then we have a phrase here that presents a unique set of contrapuntal scenarios that present us with a window that we can modulate from C to A pretty much at any point. To me, it sounds like we're modulating around here. I think we're pretty clearly in the key of C major at the beginning of the phrase, but wherever we modulate after the fact, I think is anyone's guess, and there's evidence abound to back that up, whichever stance you take. So after our 5 chord, we go to 1, C, C, G, and E, tonic triad, passing 7th in the bass, A, C, C, and F. It's a 4 chord in first inversion, 4/6. We have some passing tones, we have a passing tone, a neighbor tone, and anticipation. That would be B, D, D, and F, 7 chord, B diminished in root position, and then we go to C, B, C, and E. I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and what we have here is a deceptive progression, 7 going to 6. This is what I was confusing earlier. We saw this progression where we saw 7 going to 6, or like 7 going to 4/6 here. We have a very similar gesture going on here where we have 7 going against the grain. 7 going to 6 is probably the least common deceptive progression, but here we have it. And I think this is actually where we modulate back to the key of A minor. It's now our tonic triad. We can modulate to A minor at any point after this as well as before this. If you don't hear it exactly at this point, this is just where I chose to analyze the modulation. With modulation zones, it does present some difficulty when trying to pinpoint the exact location, but I think that's exactly what is happening, is that there isn't an exact location. It's just part of the process, and when there is ambiguity because of the shared chords between chords that are adjacent, or keys that are adjacent to one another on the circle of fifths, or not parallel, oh goodness, what's the word? I'm forgetting a really fundamental term right now. Relative. not parallel, but relative. Relative keys can present really difficult situations when you're trying to decide where a modulation occurs between them, because they share so many chords in common that you could analyze the progression in either key, which is interesting. But after our 1-6 chord, we get C, A, F, and D. I think this C is an accented non-chord tone. You might be able to make the argument this is 4-4-2. But I think, and especially because the leading tone resolve, or not the leading tone, the chordal seventh resolves down by step, I feel like this is just a lower suspension though. But lower suspension under what? I suppose it could be like a 9-10 suspension under the melody. But I do think this B is our chord tone here. This would be B, A, F, and D, which is 2-7, B minor 7 flat 5 in root position. And I think this is just a really unusual progression that just is a series of suspensions in the bass with counterpoint going on in the rest of the voices. So we have B, G, D, and G, which is like a passing 7 chord in first inversion, 7-6. It's kind of interesting because 4 typically would want to go to 7, so maybe that is the argument that maybe this is a 4 chord rather than a 2-7 chord. I think I'm going to walk that back actually and say that this is a 4-4-2 chord going to 7-6 for that exact same reason, because it's resolving the way that it's supposed to as well. But this could be a 2-7 chord as well. Initially in my notes I thought this was 2-7, but this 7 chord right here, 4 typically wants to go to 7. 2 going to 7 is not impossible, it's just less likely of a progression. We see 4 going to 7 all the time, and typically it's 4 going to a diminished 7, but we see 4 go to major 7 occasionally as well. But then we have A here, and F here, A, D, and F. We have this passing D minor chord in second inversion. We saw a similar progression earlier where we had a 4 chord, 2 4 chords bridged by a 7 chord, which makes me feel like this chord progression might have some more, there's more intention behind it because of the fact that we saw something similar earlier in the progression, or in the chorale. But as we're closing in on our half cadence, we have G sharp, B, D, and E, which is 5-6-5, E7 over G sharp. Then we have A, C, and E, that's our tonic triad in root position, A minor, and we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our 5 chord. And that's going to conclude today's analysis. This is a really unusual chorale. Like I said, the cadence is unusual. Where we modulate to and from is unusual. We have a distant modulation going on as well, which is unusual. Transitive progressions are particularly interesting. The introduction is particularly interesting. I don't know whether or not we're still in the key of A minor throughout, or if we do divert to C. I just, like I said, when I'm committing to an analysis, it's my ear that's breaking the tie, and my ear hears C major, so that's what happens. And even though mid-phrase modulations are on the less common side of things, here we have it. It's pretty unusual where it's happening. The fact that we are implying, or A minor is being implied at the beginning of the chorale, and we move to C major so quickly after the fact, makes me feel like Bach is really fluid in terms of fluctuating between the relative major and relative minor. But I'm going to conclude the video on that note. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you want to be notified of my daily upload. If you like Bach, if you like analysis, you'll get your daily fix here. There are tons of chorales left to analyze, and I'm very excited to have a look at them. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.